All right, we're going to move on to a high-yield organism, and that's Plasmodium. All right, and I said you don't have to know the life cycles, but what I'm going to do is walk you through the life cycle of Plasmodium so that when we get to the different diseases, you're going to understand when I'm talking about erythrocytic stage versus exoerythrocytic and hypnozoites and sleeping stages and things like that. So we're just going to look at the life cycle a little bit. So if you start where the organisms get injected into the bloodstream from the bite of an infected mosquito, okay, the first place they're going to go is into the liver. They're going to invade the liver parenchymal cells, and we call this the exoerythrocytic stage for malaria. In the liver, they form what's called a schizont, and that schizont will eventually rupture, as you see down here, and this initiates the erythrocytic stage for malaria. So now the schizont ruptures, gets into the red cell, forms an erythrocytic schizont, and then those red cells will eventually rupture. The febrile periods in malaria, say every 48 hours or every 72 hours, follow the cycle of red cell lysis, okay? So every time you go through one of these cycles and release new crops of merozoites, that determines those febrile episodes, all right? Now, there are two species we're going to talk about that like to hang out in the liver. That's like their favorite spot to be. That creates an additional concern when we're talking about treatment. So keep that in mind. We've got Plasmodium vivax and Plasmodium ovale. Those can remain in the liver and cause relapsing malaria. And then you have Plasmodium falciparum and Plasmodium malariae that do not hide out in the liver. All right, so Plasmodium, again, we're talking now about something that has an arthropod, not only vector, but there's actually a specific cycle that has to occur in the mosquito, and then a specific cycle that has to occur in the human in order for Plasmodium to really be infectious, okay? So there's the two different stages, in the vertebrate host and in the arthropod host. And I showed you that when I kind of walked you through the life cycle. What's going to happen, just like I said, every time you release those organisms and they're lysed from the infected cells, you're going to get the classic paroxysms of malaria, the fever, the rigors, and the chills, every time those red cells are lysed. Now, one other thing I'm going to mention about Plasmodium is that people with a sickle cell trait do have protection against Plasmodium falciparum, which is one of the reasons that you'll see sickle cell carried on in African American populations, because it does offer a selective advantage as far as protection from malaria. A couple of other random things to talk about. The Duffy blood group antigen is actually the receptor for Plasmodium vivax. And the last point I want to mention is individuals that have abnormal hemoglobins, as in the case of thalassemias, are also incapable of getting a malarial infection, which is why, again, that is maintained in the genetic population, because it does offer a selective advantage. So now what I want to do is I want to start talking about some of the different species. I am going to, before I do that, tell you that more likely than not, when they ask about malaria on step 1, they ask about Plasmodium falciparum. Why is that? It's because it's the worst, it's resistant to chloroquine, and that's usually the one that pops up most often, okay? So if you don't know, you get to a question on malaria and you're not sure, go ahead and pick falciparum, because that could quite possibly and most likely be the right answer, all right? Now, I'm going to start with Plasmodium vivax, which is also called benign tertian malaria. The disease has 48-hour fever spikes, again, following the rupture of those red blood cells. One of the diagnostic things that you're going to see for Plasmodium vivax is called a Schaffner's dots in infected red cells. Okay? So Schaffner's dots in infected red cells is diagnostic and specific for Plasmodium vivax. I'm going to jump down here to Plasmodium ovale, which if you look at the disease is the same. Benign tertian malaria, 48-hour fever spikes. What can we say about the blood? It's oval-shaped, all right? Plasmodium ovale. The blood becomes oval-shaped. So that's one of the diagnostic features for Plasmodium ovale. Although more likely to show up than ovale on step 1 is going to be Plasmodium vivax. Now, both Plasmodium vivax and ovale have that persistent stage in the liver, which means when we look at treatment, we need chloroquine to eradicate the red cell stage or the erythrocytic stage, and we need primaquine to eliminate the liver stage. Okay, so you need a two-drug regimen when you have the persistent hypnozoites in the liver. Now the other two species, Plasmodium malariae, actually they don't ask much on the boards, but you can easily identify it because it's the only one that has 72-hour fever spikes. And in the blood smear, you'll actually see a red cell with just a little bar or a band across that red cell, and that is diagnostic for Plasmodium malariae. It does not have persistence in the liver, so therefore you can just treat it with chloroquine. Now, I mentioned falciparum as probably the most highly tested as far as the malaria species on the boards, and as far as image or description, what do you need to know as far as diagnosis are, number 1, these banana-shaped or crescent-shaped gametes. Okay, so they can show you an image of that, but they typically will describe that in the infected blood cells or in a blood smear from somebody with these fever spikes. You see these characteristic banana-shaped gametes. Now, one of the other things that is common in Plasmodium falciparum, if you look at the red cell that I'm circling here, it's hard to make out, but if you can see 1, 2, 3 dots, okay, each of those dots is basically a ring form, where if you look at my ring, the dot is the dot that you see on the blood, and then just like you see this ring, the ring form follows around and connects that dot that you can actually see. There are multiple ring forms in Plasmodium falciparum, so they may mention that as well, along with the banana-shaped gametes. Plasmodium falciparum, again, is the most severe type of malaria. It's called malignant tertian malaria. There are irregular fever spikes associated with Plasmodium falciparum, and it causes cerebral malaria, particularly in children. So it's much more severe and tends to be resistant to chloroquine. All right? So as far as treatment regimens, chloroquine is usually okay, except for in falciparum. And in vivax and ovale, you have to add primaquine for the liver stage. You're definitely going to get at least a question on malaria. And again, if I had to bet and roll the dice, I would say it's going to be falciparum, but it could be one of the other species.